Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Serena Longo, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Jabari Asim, presenting his new novel, Yonder, joined in conversation by Adrian Walker. Thanks so much for joining us virtually this evening. Harvard Bookstore's virtual event series continues this winter, bringing authors and their work to our community and our digital community. Find our event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and shop our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event also has auto-generated closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. You can also disable captions there as well. In the chat, I will shortly be posting a link to purchase Yonder on harvard.com. Your purchases truly make events like tonight's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. So thank you all for tuning in and purchasing books from Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you have no doubt experienced in virtual gatherings these last many months, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And so now I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. Jabari Asim directs the MFA Program in Creative Writing at Emerson College, where he is also the Elma Lewis Distinguished Fellow in Social Justice. He is the author of numerous previous books, including the nonfiction titles, The N-Word, What Obama Means, Not Guilty, and We Can't Breathe, the children's titles, Whose Toes Are Those, and Preaching to the Chickens, and the fiction titles, A Taste of Honey and Only the Strong. He also has 2 children's titles coming out in the next several months. Joining him on our digital stage this evening is Boston Globe columnist and Pulitzer Prize finalist Adrian Walker. They'll be discussing Jabari's new novel, Yonder. Publishers Weekly calls it a searing and redemptive story of slavery and survival, and Kirkus Reviews writes in their starred review, Asim demonstrates all a novel can be, soaring and grounded, personal and epic, thrilling and quiet. A wonder-filled novel about the power of words and stories to bring hope to the most difficult situations. We're so pleased to be hosting this launch event tonight. The digital podium is yours, Adrian and Jabari.
Well, thanks to everyone for joining us. It's a great pleasure to be here with my good friend Jabari. You know, I have never been able to quite figure out when Jabari Asim sleeps. By my count, this is his 21st book, including fiction, nonfiction, essays, young adult literature, you name it. Congratulations on your latest triumph, your new novel, Yonder. And
thanks,
I believe you're going to...
I'm sorry, I was just saying thanks.
Oh, thanks. I believe you wanted to read a little bit of it for us?
Yeah, sure. Just to kind of set the stage. And I want to say thanks to Serena and Harvard Bookstore for setting this up and for making it possible for me to be in conversation with you again, Adrian. We did a similar conversation a few years back on a different book, went really well. And it was wonderful to talk with you and entertain questions from the audience. So I'm glad to be able to do that again. So I wanted to say thank you at the beginning. And thank you for agreeing to participate again. And I just wanted to set up the short excerpts that I'll read before we start talking. Yonder takes place in 1852, and most of the narrative action, as it were, circulates around 4 principal characters who are couples who have had the fortune or misfortune to fall in love while in captivity. And the book has multiple narrators, so they each tell their own stories. And then there are a few sections in which there's an omniscient third-person narrator. And the reasons for making those choices hopefully will be clear to you when you read the book. And so the first piece I'm going to read is about something that's called a whispering ceremony. The characters, the spiritual practice of the characters involves the incantation of 7 words. That's part of their daily spiritual practice, and one acquires 7 words by virtue of a whispering ceremony. So the first part will be just a little glimpse of whispering ceremony. And I should say I'm reading 4 short passages, and 3 of them involve the narrator, Cato, who's one of the principal narrators. And the 4th one is one of the sections that has a 3rd person omniscient narrator. So we'll be hearing exclusively from Cato at the beginning. I knew few of the requirements of whispering beyond my part in the ritual, from which I had been absent since my ordeal under Cupid's boot. During his Sunday visits to Green's 3 farms, Preacher Ransom made sure that certain members of his flock learned every gesture and incantation of the ceremony. We must not allow the old ways to die when I do, he often said. In contrast to those sunlit days when Ransom preached, his presence at whisperings was pursued without the approval of thieves and therefore conducted under cover of darkness. Beneath the light of a few flickering pine knots, Sarah dipped the baby into a pan of water. Even in the dimness, I could detect signs of only one parent in the girl's countenance. The twinkle in her eyes came from Sarah, as did her mouth, framed by dimples. Knowing little of Sarah's tendencies, I couldn't speculate regarding the effect they would have on the infant, but I knew enough of Milton's to wonder which of his qualities the baby would inherit. He was trained as a bricklayer, but his real talent was making pictures. Those of us who'd seen his creations could proclaim with confidence that the ancestors guided his right hand. With just a pointed stick and a patch of dust, Milton stirred marvels to life. He drew stars whirling in the night's infinite blackness, great cities of his imagination, signs and wonders he'd seen in dreams. He drew faces too. We could describe a stolen long lost to this life, and he'd make her rise from the ground, seemingly as real as if she were drawing breath. In the days leading up to the birth, he drew his daughter's face again and again. Her arrival only proved the strength of his abilities. Every detail had been exact, right down to the small mole on her downy cheek. Milton's pictures were one of our cherished secrets, fussed over and fondly remembered after the wind and rain had washed them away. The world beyond us knew nothing of his gift. The baby, bathed and rubbed down with warm oil, was wrapped in swaddling clothes. Preacher Ransom held her and spoke in tongues, mumbling ancient phrases while we hummed softly. Once finished, he passed the baby to Sarah. She gathered her in her arms. Moving in a circle, each of us paused when we reached the quietly squirming infant. One by one, we whispered. A baby fortunate to survive long enough to acquire the gift of speech learned quickly about the world into which she was born. There was the likelihood she would never have a chance to use such words as mother or father. Instead, she would learn terms like stolen and thief right after she learned her own name. But no matter the circumstances, she would always find sustenance in the 7 words whispered in her ear. They were our constant companions through every tribulation and every brief moment of transcendence. They reminded us to breathe in the morning and be grateful for air. Okay, and this next section, I will read the next passage just to provide a glimpse of interpersonal relationships. This is from a section in which Cato recalls his relationship with a woman named Iris. Green allowed us to keep company whenever it didn't inconvenience him. With his permission, I endeavored to make Iris a stool from leftover wood. She had developed a habit of sitting on the humble stoop in front of her cabin and resting on cool evenings. Although I revered the ground she sat upon, I deemed it unworthy of her touch. Nothing cheered me more than seeing her perched on that stool as I approached. At the time, I knew nothing of queens, of royal figures perched regally on thrones, but I knew that my Iris possessed nobility that far surpassed her lowly surroundings. I would sit at her feet, grateful for the simple gift of her attention, until we entered her cabin. Once, when we were reclining comfortably in each other's arms, I asked her to name her favorite color. "Whatever color you are," she said. Iris, tell me your favorite color. Describe it to me. I'd say you're about the same as polished walnut. I saw you rubbing that stool you'd made me. You insisted on making it gleam before I could sit down on it. I remember you with that cloth rubbing. I couldn't tell where your hand ended and the wood began. Polished walnut. Iris, just tell me. She rolled over and faced me. Cato, you're my favorite, and that's as far as I go with it. Declaring my fondness for things means I got to feel the hurt when they're taken away. Nothing good lasts. I'm going to last, I told her. I swear it on my 7 words. Good, she said, grinning again. The only thing I've let my heart linger on is you. That wasn't completely true. She kept mementos of the people she'd lost, a patch of straw from an old hat, a yank of hair from a baby who had been sold. She kept those things in a pouch, hanging from a cowhide string around her waist, as was the habit of many stolen women. She never talked much about her departed loves, but I knew they lived in her heart too. After we lay together for the first time, she put stray locks from my beard into her pouch. I found myself grateful that she had made room for me. Nestled against her, I learned more about the 2 children she'd born and lost, about the straw hat her mother took off her head and handed to her before new thieves yanked her away. How Iris wore it until the sun burned through its tattered fringe. Her stammers and pauses showed me how hard it was for her to talk about the people she loved and who had loved her. They remained mostly a part of her private self. Okay, in this passage, Cato has undergone an ordeal because he's had a conflict with the thief who holds him in captivity. This ordeal leads to a change of heart for Cato, which leads to significant changes in the novel. Rain had been falling for hours. Perhaps fall is too gentle a word. It was the kind of downpour that leaves scars, grooves, and dents in the earth. I shivered in my chains, blinking rapidly as it came down in sheets and pellets. With silent Mary's broth coursing through my innards, I had regained sufficient strength to hold myself in a sitting position, resting my head against the post. I had only to be alive until daybreak, and Green would remove my chains, leaving me bound to him nonetheless. Soaked to the bone, I awaited the dawn while considering the looming paradox of my situation, what little I had to live for. In the distance, the splintered gray boards of our cabins appeared to tremble and dissolve in the wet. The resulting cloud of grayness, murky and unsettled, gradually took on new shapes, outlines of boys and girls. Struck dumb, I watched while they marched down the corridor of the quarters toward me before veering sharply and proceeding toward the plantation borders. Clad in garments I had never seen, nothing like our sackcloth and threadbare cast-offs. They passed me in shades of gray, nearly close enough to touch. I had thought of my ancestors as ancient, with a history of torment etched on their weathered faces. But these were children, ranging in age from 5 harvests to 15, with gleaming faces and vigorous frames. I didn't understand their youthfulness. I understood only that they had been in the world before I came to it, and that they now belonged to some other place. Occasionally, a boy or girl would pause and look at me, then rejoin the procession without missing a step. They walked unsullied through the mud, so smoothly as if they were gliding on cushions of air. I called to them, but any sound I made was lost in the fury of the gale. Already shivering, I became consumed by a different kind of chill, a peculiar sensation unlike anything I had ever known. I sensed the presence of an energy at work, quick, elusive, and beyond my comprehension. I did infer, however, that submitting to melancholy would undo the labors of those who had come before me, that I had an obligation to resist instead of giving in. I rose unsteadily to my feet, aware of my shackles, but determined to somehow overcome them. My ancestors, so resolute and curiously young, had shown me a glimpse, perhaps, of the end of sorrows. So I'll end with this section from a passage from a section called Haint. And it's a third person narration in which a woman named Sarah is being transported from one plantation to another in the company of a detestable overseer named Holtzclaw. So I will find that passage. Okay. Having helped himself to Silent Mary's baked goods without offering Sarah so much as a nibble, Holtzclaw deduced that he had been perhaps too hasty in his consumption. Midpoint between Placid Hall and Two Forks, his stomach had grown angry and demanded relief. He halted the wagon at the side of a tree-lined road, climbed down, and hurried into a thicket of vines. Sarah could see the top of his head as he squatted and grunted. She could also see a rock, substantial yet handy, on the ground between him and the wagon. She studied it, imagining what she could do with it and calculating the speed and stealth she'd need to cover the distance. Slowly, quietly, she swung her legs over the side of the wagon. Before she could lower her feet to the ground, a flicker of motion in the trees above her head made her pause. She looked up and saw, crouching on a branch, a creature from another world. It rested on one haunch, the other leg fully extended along the length of the branch, with both arms stretched upward and grasping an overhead limb. The being's clothes were made to resemble bark, enabling it to blend almost seamlessly against its background. Most striking was its face, in broad strokes of brown and green, painted so closely together that no flesh showed. Was it a haint? An angel? Sarah was too awestruck to hazard a guess. Without losing balance, the creature folded an elegant arm and placed a finger to its lips. Sarah nearly gasped when the creature leaped and landed gracefully on silent feet. It squatted and, securing Sarah's attention, drew in the dirt with its index finger. After making sure Sarah saw the marks it made, it rubbed them away. Quick as death, it scampered up a tree and returned to its perch. His bowels settled, Holtzclaw came back to the wagon and noticed a glow on Sarah's face. He chuckled to himself, concluding that her radiance was a sign of the excitement he assumed he aroused in stolen winches. Sarah lived to experience even more surprises, but none as wondrous as her encounter with the mystical figure that swooped down from the trees. She knew then that she would always remember the angel's marks in the dirt, even if she never learned to make sense of them. The cryptic letters burned in her memory as if they had been written in flames. In due time, the words read. I think I'll stop there.
That is all just beautiful.
Thank you.
Hey, what was the inspiration for Yonder?
I
What
think
was that first with her?
I had been reading about a man named William Lee, who had lived about nearly a century before the events described in Yonder. He was described as a valet to George Washington during the American Revolution. And of course, he was enslaved. And according to historians, he served Washington so ably in combat that Washington said, when this is over, as your reward, the woman you love, whose name was Margaret, Margaret was a free woman. Washington said, she can come and live in Mount Vernon with you. And again, according to historians, when the war was over, it was determined that Martha Washington didn't like this woman. So she actually was not invited to come and live with William Lee on the plantation. And records show that as an older man, William Lee is listed as living alone. So his partner was not with him. And I thought about that a lot. What if you do this heroic work, sort of against your will, but you're still behaving heroically during this war and combat in danger. And you think that you're going to get this reward of being with the person you love afterwards, and you find out it's not going to happen. And it always kind of stuck with me. I wondered how he felt. And I began to sort of imagine that story. In the course of imagining it, I moved away from the actual historical figures, moved the story forward. And I think it was about 2008 when the first lines came to me. I carry a little notebook around with me. I was in Champaign, Illinois. I was walking down the street, and the first lines came to me, and I wrote them down. I put them in my notebook, and I put them in my computer to save. I had a lot of projects going at the time, and I knew it was not something that I would turn to anytime soon. But occasionally, I would get it out and I would look at those lines, and maybe jot some notes, that sort of thing. And in the finished draft of Yonder, those are still the first lines. So I ended up not deviating at all from the first lines that came to me.
But how does that process work? And I'm fascinated because you've written 10 books in between, right? So did you just file this away and go back to it every, January 11th, or how does this work?
Not that organized, but I mean, so when those lines came to me, I was already committed to the novel that became Only the Strong. I was working on it. I also had nonfiction projects under contract, so those took priority. But I just started a file, right? I started a file on my computer whenever anything I thought would work in the context of Yonder. I would just put it in there. And eventually, over time, you finish projects, you go back and go, wow, I've got a lot assembled here. If I spend some time with it, maybe I can start putting this together. And then I wrote, I don't know, at some point I wrote close to 100 pages, and I was still working on something else. I can't remember what I was working on, but I sent the 100 pages to my agent and said, when you have a spare moment, take a look at this. Tell me if you think, this can continue in the way that I envision it. And she wrote back, oh yeah, this is great. You should finish this, right? So I started working on it like on breaks between teaching and things like that. I would just, I had an outline, and the ending came to me fairly early. And so I had an ending that I could write to. I actually wrote the ending. And then complications ensued because I thought of another ending, which is rare for me. Usually I stick with the ending I started with. And I read the two different endings to my wife and said, pick one. And so the ending she picked is the one that's in the book. But once I had the ending, I could write to it. I could write toward the ending.
So, Yonder is part of this ever-growing, genre really of slave fiction. What's it like trying to enter into that world imaginatively and then try to create it?
Well, some years ago, a prominent African-American novelist who had written about, this period in American history had written an essay saying, I think the writers that come after me should not write about slavery. It's time to write about something else. And I kind of laughed out loud because I said, now I have to do it. Tell people they can't write about things. And I'm so happy that so many other people have totally disregarded that essay as well and have written a lot of wonderful pieces. So I think we've barely, we haven't even scratched the surface of the stories that can be told about that period. I think they all need to be told. They're all worthy of an audience. And so I feel like I've entered a conversation that has been going on for a while and that I hope will continue indefinitely, because it's only just begun, really, relatively speaking.
No, that's true. And it's a really robust conversation if you think about all the books that are part of it. There is a lot of love in this book and a bit of sex too. And I mean, one of the interesting things about this is that it's romance in the most unromantic setting imaginable. Talk to me about that part of the book and how it functions.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we cannot downplay the suffering and the oppression and the brutality of the period, which was, constant. But we also can't ignore the reality that loving relationships among Black people formed consistently during this period, and that we are the result of those relationships. And so, Black people obviously didn't lose their capacity to love while being brutalized, and us forming loving, lasting relationships was extremely detrimental to slavery and white supremacy, legally enforced, violently enforced white supremacy of the time. So I'm looking at love, as a form of resistance. I'm always fascinated in the various ways in which Black people resisted their captivity. And love, of course, becomes one of those ways. So I really wanted to address that and imagine that, what that's like. And also, there's certain rational decisions that one might be able to make if one finds a partner and the partner is equally attracted to you. And you might say, well, let's live together, or let's just spend time together. It doesn't even have to be any more committed than that. But in this situation, the most irrational of circumstances, you can't do that. It's totally not up to you. So how do you work around that? What arrangements can you make between these consenting adults? Like, I want to be with you, and you want to be with me. How can we make this worth, and what is worth risking, right? Is it worth risking our lives? We have to have these conversations, and everyone's not going to say, yeah, it's worth risking our lives. Some people are not, okay, I'm drawing the line there, but others are like, no, this is it for me. There's a character in the novel early on who keeps trying to be with the woman who wants to be with him, and the people in control do not want that. So the man says to him, are you willing to, die to be with a woman I say you can't be with? And he says, if it takes dying, because he's made that decision, right? And so I just wanted to spend some time with people who were thinking about and wrestling with these questions, and seeing what their reactions were.
Well, it's moving to me because they fought so hard for it, and the obstacles are so great.
Yeah, and we know, we know that is a historical fact. We know that this is, William Lee is not the only example of that, right? And so I just wanted to begin to tell those stories, and that's how I arrived at the multiple narrators. I really wanted different characters to explain it from their point of view. This is the situation I found myself in. This is what I thought about. This is what I feared. This is what I believed. And then of course they debate, they argue. They talk about things like faith and resistance and obedience and all of these loaded terms that were concrete and not just abstract concepts to them that they had to deal with.
Yeah. Of course, being a novel about people in bondage, it's also a novel about people who wanting to be free, striving to be free. I mean, what does freedom mean to the characters in Yonder?
Well, I think mostly it means freedom to choose, right? Do I want to work today? Do I want to sleep late? Do I want to work on crops? Or say the character of Milton, who's trained as a bricklayer, he's trained to build, but his genius is visual arts in a time where the idea of a Black painter is almost absurd, right? So he makes these amazing pictures in the dirt that are washed away. And he also knows enough to keep this gift from his oppressors, from his captors, right? That this is something they don't need to know about. And that kind of increases the element of joy, not just to him, but to his audience. Milton, make us a picture. And then the picture's gone. And it's like, it's part of their secret lives. And so I think it often just comes down to freedom to choose, freedom to love, freedom to leave, freedom to explore, because these characters also are very aware of their very limited geographical knowledge. They often speak of how little they know of the world beyond the borders of this place where they're confined. So they talk about it. What do you think is yonder? What's out there?
Yes.
And they have a lot of different ideas.
Well, they've heard of this place called Canada, and they've heard
Right.
of this place called Africa, but they don't have much sense of like where they would be.
Right. I mean, if I escape, if I leave this place, is Africa next door? Is Canada next door? How far away are these places? And if I go to these places, are there people waiting for me and are waiting to welcome me? And one of the things in terms of doing research, I read certain slave narratives where they talked about the stories that their captors created to discourage them from wanting to leave. And so there were horror stories about Canadians and the horrible things they did to Black people. If you should find yourself in the hands of Canadians, it's going to be bad. So the last thing you want to do is get to Canada, right? So they knew these stories and they debated them. Do you think that's true? You know, do you think that Canadians will do this, or are they really just trying to keep us here, at all costs? So, the other thing I wanted to show was that that these enslaved people were also philosophers. They're developing worldviews in a really tiny space, right? So they do have to speculate about their role, not just where they are, but in the world and in the universe and the cosmos. What does all this mean? I mean, one character says, one of our common questions was not just why were we born, but why were we born here, in this particular place, and what does that mean?
Can you talk a little more about the process of researching this novel?
Yeah, I reread Frederick Douglass's 3 memoirs. I read a memoir by Lewis Clark, which was very influential. I read a book. I'm not going to be able to think of it while we're talking, but Betty DeRamus did a book of a nonfiction book about love relationships on the Underground Railroad that I read many years ago. I may even have reviewed it. I don't remember, but the book stuck with me and impressed me. So I credit that as a source as well, just for encouraging me to think about these things. There are lots of slave narratives. I read Yuval Taylor's collection of slave narratives about young people, what it was like to be a young person enslaved, personal family history. My ancestors that I know about whose experiences in slavery have been documented and archived. And so mainly a lot of reading. I read a really good essay by a historian about life at Mount Vernon, which gave me some good ideas. And I read Henry Wincheck's book about George Washington and the world that he created with his enslaved people at Mount Vernon. So just a lot of different stuff. And then at some point, I put all that aside to give my imagination free rein. So sometimes an incident may have been prompted or inspired by something I know actually happened, but I take it in a different direction intentionally, so that it's filtered through my imagination and becomes something different.
Can you talk a little bit about the language you use to kind of capture this? I'm especially intrigued by the idea of the stolen and the thieves.
Yeah. Well,
was that in the first draft?
that was in the very first draft, because I'm always kind of intrigued by a lot of the language that is used to describe the history of racial oppression in the country it clearly exists to mollify the oppressors, right? Because we don't want the oppressors to feel bad about the brutality they've inflicted upon others. But I thought, if we turn the gaze around, it's irresistible and unavoidable to not conceive of these enslaved people as seeing their captors as morally bankrupt, right? And so I really wanted to play with that, the idea that they're thieves because they steal people, they steal land, et cetera. And we want to acknowledge that in our designation of them. And that also, I do think that Black people have often resisted being categorized by others, right? And so I wanted to kind of play with that a lot in the language. And also, I really like the idea of Black people having private ways to communicate, because it was necessary. And undoubtedly, we've developed them and sustained them, right? So I have the characters speak a sort of broken English when they are, having conversation with their captors, but among each other, they are quite eloquent in every sense of the word. And I really enjoy doing that.
You talk about the 7 words everyone has.
Yeah, I totally made that up. That's not.
I was going to ask. I've never read that anywhere.
Yeah, I totally made that up. That's not based on anything. But one of the things I got to thinking about was spiritual practices, right? And so I thought, what if these people came up with a spiritual practice that might have some roots in where their ancestors come from, maybe not, but was distinct from the spiritual practices of their captors, right? So So we have this character, Preacher Ransom, who is, very versed in the spiritual practices of their captors, but also knows the old ways and the ways that they've synthesized since their captivity in this strange land. And so I began to envision how I could put that together. And since on many levels, the novel's about language and different uses of language, I thought, let's have the spiritual practice itself revolve around language. Right. So I had a lot of fun with that.
Yes. Okay, there was a request in the Q&A to read the opening lines that started.
It's really short. So yeah, let me see if I can find it. Okay. All of us have two tongues. The first is for them, a broken joke of language. It is a lament cloaked in deception, a bloody strangeness in our throats. It tastes of copper, salt, and dust. The second is for us. It is a song of dreams and drums, whispered promises and incantations. We spoke it in the quarters during the rare late nights and early mornings when they were not looking into our mouths for signs of betrayal. This tongue is rich, savory, and if we're not mindful, can bring us to ruin. This tongue reminds us that despite everything, we love.
Wow.
That's it.
I can see why that would stick with you. Don't cut that.
Right.
What is it that allows you to move so fluidly from genre to genre? I mentioned earlier that you've written everything from essays to poetry to novels.
I'm not sure fluidly is the word. Let's say I move from them. I think part of it is my own attention span. I get a little restless, and it's hard for me to just think in one genre because when I'm working on nonfiction, I'm also thinking about fiction, and I feel like I should write it down if I get ideas, right? And I tell my students I would rather finish a project and have it be bad and put it in a drawer than half finish something that was sounding really good. So that's my particular neuroses. If I get the idea and I'm foolish enough to write it down, I kind of feel obligated to work it to exhaustion until it's done. And so I do that. And sometimes it's not worth sharing with you. And then other times I'm like, yeah, that wasn't too bad. We can expose this to the world, So, but a lot of times it just starts from some idea, and I don't know yet what shape it's going to take, right? So I just kind of write some stuff down and see what it feels like. I mean, it's almost an intuitive process. I reread a lot what I've jotted down. I just kind of, and I do it in a space of deep relaxation. I have no pressure on myself, and I'm just kind of reading it and watching the words and see how they want to arrange themselves. But I do tend to be very relaxed when I'm in the process of writing, as opposed to having my fist balled up and my brow furrowed. And the more relaxed I am, the more likely it is that whatever I've jotted down will begin to show me the form that it needs to take.
How do you decide what's next?
Usually, frankly, contracts, whatever I have on contract has to be next. And that can be a problem sometimes because, I'm getting all these ideas about something else, but I'm like, oh, I signed this contract, so I will work on this and I will get it done. So I tend to prioritize. If I've signed a contract with something, I'm going to work on that first, but it doesn't mean I'm not going to work on the other things. I'm still going to work on them, but like Yonder was not under contract. It was essentially written on spec. And so I was really relaxed about it. It's like, whenever I finish it, that's when it's finished. Right. So whenever I had a space, I might write a page or two. There's no pressure. There's no editor saying, when are you going to get that to me? No editor saw it until it was done. Right. So a project like that never takes priority. The other projects do.
Yeah. I was thinking that, only the strong is set more or less contemporary, in the world of St. Louis and your childhood. Yeah. Yonder's historical. What was different about writing a historical novel?
That's a good question. I'm not sure how different it was for me because um, some of the same questions are being explored. Like in Only the Strong, it revolves essentially around three couples, you know, and you know how they can make love work in the community in which they find themselves. And so this is similar too. So I think I'm always kind of starting from that point. Who are the characters and what do they want, right? And what's between them and what they want. And you know, I just kind of go from there.
You know, I have an audience question. Someone asked, is there a genre you haven't written in yet that you'd like to?
Um, I have fantasies of writing for film and television. I would love to do that. I haven't done that. I've written sample scripts, I guess, but you know, they're on this desk somewhere. It's not something that I've pursued with intensity for many years. So I do think about that from time to time, especially because so many of my friends who write books are now doing that as well. Right. And so I'm kind of keeping up with them vicariously. Oh, I was in the writer's room for this project. It was really exciting. Maybe I would hate it. I don't know. but I think about that. I mean, because I mean, the great benefit I think of the genres that I do write in is that they are solitary. It's just me, you know, it's not a committee. It's not a writer's room. And I have to confess that I really like that. I really like that it's just me and the page. So, you know, maybe I wouldn't, but yeah, I would say I would like to see what that's like, just to have the experience. And if I didn't like it, I would say, well, I tried it and, you know, it wasn't for me.
Come on, Jabari, Hollywood's calling, man.
You're right.
I see that Netflix deal coming.
Yeah, okay.
Hey, another audience question. An audience member says, I love the whispering ceremony. Was wondering if you made it up or if it was based on something else.
Totally made up. Absolutely made up.
What surprised you most from your research in this book?
What surprised me most? That's a difficult question. I mean, I've done a lot of research on this period just for various nonfiction projects that I've worked on. So I'm not sure if there were many surprises. That's a really hard question. I think okay, one way that I get surprised is, and I think this was true in Only the Strong also, is I do an initial outline and I decide who the principal characters are going to be and who the supporting characters are going to be. And that always changes because characters assert themselves. And so that certainly happened here. So going back to the very beginning, there's one narrator, William. Originally, the whole book was going to be William. These other characters existed, but they weren't telling the story. And they kind of elbowed their way into the room where, no, I have to tell this part, right? And so that was a surprise. That wasn't planned. But I've had enough experience now, fortunately, that I knew to listen to them, right? When Cato said, well, the way William told that is not quite how it went down from my point of view. This is how it went down. I have enough sense now to write that down. Instead of saying, no, this book is being told solely through the experiences of one man. And one of the characters, Pandora, who ends up playing a significant part, did not have a significant part in my mind when I began, but she kept elbowing her way to the foreground, saying, you know, my experience is somewhat different from these other characters that you've created. Her experience is very different from the other characters in the book. And also, she became this vehicle. I read something really intriguing. I can't remember if it was about Tolstoy or Chekhov, but somebody was writing about a particular character and the interior life of that character and how it was somehow very different from the exterior life. And so Pandora became that character because she often seems kind of like fog bound, but it's because she has this extraordinary imagination in which she lives somewhere else. She doesn't live where the action's taking place. So you call her name Pandora, and she goes, right. So I thought it would be fun to kind of, you know, go into her mind and where she was during those periods. So all of that was surprising. It wasn't what I initially envisioned.
What's the difference for you between writing male and female characters?
Not a significant difference. I listen to the voice, right? And I feel like I know people from, you know, every self-identified gender. I've heard them speak. And, you know, it becomes imagination. But also, I guess they all had monologues in my drafts where they're kind of telling their story. And later I'm thinking about how can I make that contribute to the plot? I actually want the plot to move. I want things to go from A to B to C. I like that as a writer and as a reader. And also, so sometimes I just imagine the conversation, like, for example, William has conversations with his partner, Margaret, and in many of the conversations, she kind of challenges him, says, like there's even one where he says something to her that he thinks is really beautiful and romantic or something, and she thinks it's crap, right? And she tells him, right? And so I don't know. I think it isn't the hardest thing to imagine the other side of a conversation, I think. And so I've been fortunate to be able to do that. And I'd rather attempt it and get it wrong than not attempt it. I'd rather have readers say, that female character, the voice wasn't quite there for me, rather than why weren't there any female voices, right? I'd rather show that point of view and have people say it wasn't convincing than to not do it at all.
Sure. Audience question: how do you see the relationship between histories and stories? Do you agree with the idea that maybe the only difference is the percentage of fictional elements? And would you prefer to say that stories are embedded in history or that stories reshape history?
I would say both. And I'm just so fascinated with story, and I'm so aware of, oh man, I wish I could find that passage. I have a passage where Margaret addresses those very questions, and William does too at some point. He says it's all in the telling, right? And so I think that that's often the relationship between story and history. Who is telling the story, and what do they have to gain by telling it in a particular way? So I don't do a lot of it in the book, but I am fascinated by books and stories and novels in which characters relate specifically about the same event that they both were at and have completely different points of view, right? And history comes out of that, right? And so I don't know if that's a concrete answer, but it is something that I think about a lot and find endlessly fascinating.
Hey, one last audience question. Can you talk about how teaching and writing work together for you or don't? And is there a dialogue between those two roles?
I think so. I think teaching is very helpful to me because I'm reading and writing and talking about reading and writing. And I think one thing kind of feeds the other. I think the writing benefits from the teaching and the teaching benefits from the writing. And there's not a real departure from the roles. I'm always immersed in literature, one way or the other. And so I feel very fortunate because like conversations that I have with colleagues and with students are conversations I would be having anyway. It just wouldn't be my job. It just would be what I love to do, right? It's like, well, let's meet for coffee and talk about stuff, right? What have you read? What have I read? What are you working on, right? And we do those things. So I'm just doing it in an academic setting, which turns out to be helpful for me, and I hope as helpful to the students. So I'm glad to be doing it. And I was a full-time journalist for many, many years before teaching, and I like that, but I like teaching more, I have to say. It's a really good fit for me, and I'm glad to be doing it.
Come on, don't you miss newsrooms?
Not at all. I leave them in capable hands like yours. They're better off that way.
Hey, another audience question. Can you talk more about the spiritual themes and magical realism aspects of the novel?
Sure. So, in the community I grew up in and in other African-American communities I've been in, let's see, regardless of the specific spiritual practice that people may have, there is a fairly consistent concession that the barriers between the so-called physical world and so-called spiritual world are permeable, that there isn't this concrete division of this either or, as it's often portrayed. And so I grew up that way. That's what I heard. That's I have no reason to doubt that. And so I wanted the material world and the spiritual world in the book to have that kind of transference, to be to have a permeable barrier between them. And I think that kind of comes from the culture that I come from. And also just personally, I believe very strongly in ancestors with the capital A. And I do think that my ancestors, if I don't think of time as a linear thing, I do think that my ancestors intervene on my behalf. And so I have them play a similar role. Ancestors play a similar role in Yonder, and also in Only the Strong. There's a trio of 3 female ancestors who play a really Lucy, Betsy, and Erica, which play a significant role in the plot there. So it's something that I've done with some consistency, this idea of ancestral intervention. And, I accept the term magical realism, but I'm not sure that it applies so easily because I feel or choose not to recognize a difference necessarily between magic and realism, and especially in the lives of Black people. When we talk about what our ancestors endured, what they survived, what they overcame, first thing I think of is magical, right? But we know it's real because it actually happened, because we're talking right now, right? So I'm thinking about all those things as I write.
It's all magic.
Yeah, on some level.
It's almost time to wrap up. Tell me, though, about your other 2 books that are coming out later in 2022.
Let's see. I have a picture book for primary school readers, and the title of it has recently been changed. I'm trying to remember it. It's called Me and Muhammad Ali, I think is the current title. It's from Penguin Random House. It's a picture book, and the illustrations are by A.G. Ford, and it's inspired by a real life incident involving my mother and Muhammad Ali when I was a teenager. So I kind of fictionalized it. And when Muhammad Ali died, I posted a paragraph talking about my mother's encounter with Muhammad Ali. My whole family worshipped Muhammad Ali, and my mom was probably #1 fan. And she met him, and she had this magical experience with him. And I mentioned it when he died on Facebook, and someone responded in the comments, "That sounds like a children's book." And I went, so I turned it into a children's book. And so that comes out in September, I think. And then in December, I have a nonfiction book for middle school readers called A Child's Introduction to Jazz, which is a companion volume to a book I did earlier called A Child's Introduction to African American History. So I'm reunited with the editor with whom I did that book. And the Muhammad Ali book, I'm reunited with the editor that I did Preaching to the Chickens with, my book about John Lewis. I'm doing a lot of reuniting with editors. And my next adult book is nonfiction. It's called American Struggle. It's a collection of essays on race, culture, and imagination. It's Simon & Schuster. And I'm reuniting with the editor that I did The N-Word with many years ago. So a lot of reunions taking place.
Well, a lot of people want to work with you again, apparently.
It's I'm gonna accept it that way, but I still find that hard to believe. They can say that. I can't say that.
Jabari, thanks so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Congratulations on a marvelous book. And this has been a real pleasure.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I could talk with you anytime. And thanks.
You write so many books that we can do this again soon.
Sounds like a plan. And thanks again, Serena. Thanks for making this happen.
Thanks to you both. This was a really fascinating conversation, and it's just really great to hear more about this book. And I just dropped the link to buy it at Harvard Bookstore in the chat again. So do check it out. It's absolutely worth a look. And of course, we're just always delighted to have you, Jabari. Every time you've got a new book, we're here to host. So
good to know. Good to know.
Looking forward to the next time. And thank you, all of you out there, for spending your evening with us. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, keep reading, stay well, and be safe. Thank you.
Good night.
Have a great night.